Wow. Thank you, Ariana, and thank you everyone for taking an hour and a half out of your winter evenings to spend on Zoom with us. We'll try to keep it engaging and to engage you as well. Before we kick in to our presentation, which we will sort of toss back and forth between us, but it might be helpful to take the time to talk about our connection to the land that we all share. You've heard our bios, but all of us are involved in conservation or indeed interested in this topic because we love these places. So here's my brief. Julia will tell you hers. Grew up within 30 miles of where I now live. I hadn't planned on that. I did spend 8 years boarding school and college and 4 years in Africa, but turns out this is a pretty extraordinary draw, and back I came. I've lived in all 3 states around the 3-state line between Northwest Connecticut, Southwest Mass, and Eastern New York. And so I'm really comfortable with the fact that ecological boundaries don't care about that stuff. I went to a school district that was different from the post office address, which was different from the actual town where I lived. And that's probably similar for some of you too. It also means that this landscape was my childhood wilderness. It was the place that I looked up to quite literally, particularly heading into Millerton from where I lived in Millbrook, and staring up at the Raga Plateau without even knowing what it was. So it's been a joy for me in my professional life to be involved in helping some of you and many people ensure that this extraordinary landscape and some of those qualities that endear it to us and that they persist over time, which is a big piece of what Follow the Forest is about. Julia.
Sure, thanks, Tim. And thanks everyone so much for being here. So I grew up in South Central Pennsylvania and was fortunate to have parents who took me outside from basically day one. I spent my childhood playing throughout the mountains of South Central Pennsylvania and south throughout the Southeast in the Appalachian Trail corridor. And then I attended college in Maine and ultimately ended up in Connecticut as what I thought would sort of be a temporary place for my master's degree that I got at UConn. And while I was getting my master's degree, I returned to one of my favorite activities, which was whitewater kayaking, discovered the Housatonic Valley and realized what a special place this area is. And I'm really excited to be working for an organization that shares my passion for the river and just generally being outside and connecting to these landscapes that we so much care about. So Tim, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and pass it back to you.
All right. We started with that because everything that follows, even if it's steeped in science, is about values, yours, ours, and the importance of not seeing ourselves as distinct from the environments that we share. The name forest was offered up by someone who saw one of our early maps, which was trying to make the case that it's important to link large habitats. And the large habitats that we were talking about are familiar to all here, the areas that are forested and upland kind of dominate the landscape. And that person said, oh yeah, it's obvious, you follow the forest, which indeed one does, and many creatures do. This forest is really significant. By some measure, it's the most intact temperate broadleaf ecosystem worldwide. And so it's competing with China and Japan for that, but nonetheless, really extraordinary, stretching by some measures from the deep south and the Mississippi Valley up into the Maritimes of Canada. So a phenomenal at that scale forest system. And I could think of any number of reasons to say why trees are important and why forests are important, and many of them. But the air that we breathe and the water that we drink and the places that sustain our souls and everything that's within these forests is connected and life-sustaining for us. That happens to be, for the benefit of Ann Williams, who's on here, two of my children when they were young, climbing along a trail on a property she knows well up to the high point of Connecticut. And this here too shows that the landscape is not entirely trees. There's lots of things that intersect with it, but movement is a key quality here. Everything in that forest moves, even the trees. It takes them a while to do it, but they do. So a phenomenal sort of foundational life-sustaining habitat. And it's all around us. And if you think of our history, it's gone through some substantial changes. And I'm going to pause here, Julia, with the slides, because I'm going to go on a riff about glaciers, which are not in there. But I'd mentioned earlier, forests move. And in geologic time, they absolutely do. And they shift in what species find them hospitable and how they are distributed over time. And we're in a time of great change in the composition and structure of our forest habitats. 20,000 years ago, there were not trees here. There was half a mile to 3/4 of a mile of glacial ice. And as those ice sheets melted faster than they could advance and bare earth eventually, or sand and gravel was left, some of the first trees to reappear on the landscape were pines. They were jack pines and they were pitch pines, and they were dispersed by animals. And the pitch pines are still with us. They're in two very concentrated habitat types throughout eastern New York and western New England. They're either on very high exposed acidic ridgetops, like you might see on Mount Everett in Massachusetts, in the town of Mount Washington and Sheffield, or they are in outwash plains like they have up at the Albany Pine Bush. And otherwise, those trees now you would find in the Jersey Pine Barrens or on eastern Long Island or Cape Cod, because other species occupied other habitat niches. And this happened over millennia. About 5,000 years ago, the trees that we associate with this region established themselves, and even then changed. There were a lot more hemlock before that time, and then they crashed to about 5% of what's around. That's climate and other factors that did that. So now we're in a period where 400 years ago, European colonization brought tremendous changes to a forested landscape that had been managed to various degrees by indigenous people before that. The forests here have grown back at least twice. Different trees, different habitats sustained by them. But the key here is change and movement. That particularly with climate, some habitat types find it harder to persist over time or find it really easy. Some species find it more or less hospitable, and we're going through dramatic changes now that are accentuating that. So I mentioned that at this point because I want you to hold in your heart the fact that you can look around and see lots of trees. But what you're looking at is an ecosystem in flux and change, as it has always been to some degree, and in ways it has never been before, or at least not since human beings have existed. Let's go a little further. We're making the point here that the forest habitats, whether they are relatively small or increasingly large, are, to use a term of art, the matrix in which a lot of other habitats and other systems are embedded. So if you think of a mountain, or if you think of the slopes of a wooded area that you're familiar with, there are some plant and animal species that need the interior forest there. There are some that pass through it. There's some that rely on the water that it filters that are linked to it. So while we are focused on forest, we're focused on the web of interconnected habitats with forests at their heart. What we're scrolling through right now, by the way, in case you felt like doing that someday, is called a story map. And HVA put this together as a way for you to take a journey without me narrating it. And we can make that link available another time for those who want to kind of explore further. So why follow the forest? What does that mean? There's a truism in ecological thinking that islands, if isolated from each other, can over time have rather interesting endemic species, but the species diversity drops. You get fewer of them. And if there aren't ways for interspecies connectivity, they can end up being so isolated that either you get the Galapagos, right, which is pretty extraordinary and unlike anything else, or you no longer have much diversity. Well, forests are somewhat the same. The smaller ones, or the ones that are at some distance from each other because of other things on the landscape, including our infrastructure, are at some risk of losing the plant and animal species that they sustain now and the habitats that they're part of if there aren't connections between them. And there's been some really interesting work done even in the Amazon, showing the value of even small corridors of connected habitat between forests going through areas of deforestation that have allowed for much of the biodiversity they contain to thrive because of those movements. So there's a couple concepts here we're going to talk about next, and there's a lot of science in it, but it boils down to this, and Julia will talk you through it. It boils down to larger habitats tend to be more resistant to ice storms and tornadoes and people building houses inside of them than smaller ones. And the connections between them are not always obvious, but are kind of essential to allowing the species that pass through or live within those forests to move. So Julia, here we go.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So I think sort of one of the keys to do at the start of this is really set up some of the terms that you may hear Tim and I use. And there's sort of a collection of terms that we can use a little bit interchangeably, but this image in front of you does a really good job of displaying this information to you. So if we start by thinking about cores, when we're referring to cores, we are referring to contiguous interior forest. So looking at this map, you can see this large core here, which is this dark green in the image. And the key here is that the edge of the forest has been removed. Forest edges have different characteristics than the interior forest. And in many ways, that edge protects the interior forest from things like increased temperature, increased light, potential increased pollution, or changes in noise levels. So as we think about the need for species to have large blocks of contiguous habitat, that edge is a very different habitat type than the interior forest. So when we're talking about cores, it's contiguous interior forest. However, not all cores are the same. You can see on this map, we're talking about both large cores and small cores. And as Tim mentioned, those larger cores are going to have more resilience to large disturbances or even climate change as we think about our changing landscape. And I'm going to thank you for muting. And in addition to that, the size and shape of the core matters as well. So you can see here we've referred to perforated forest. And so each sort of disruption within the forest is changing how that contiguous interior forest is related, and therefore how the habitat types and the species interact amongst it. You can also see that we have some areas of core forest that are really narrow and other areas that are larger and more circular. And as we think through conservation and habitat values, having more of these larger protected blocks of interior forest, we're able to better support the species that require it. And Tim, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks. Of course, I could say some provocative things right now, so I will. Like, one of them is, are you saying that, Tim and Julia, that any activity in a forest that perforates it is bad? And the answer is no, in context. None of us are saying you can't cut trees. None of us are saying that edge habitat doesn't have value for many species, including a lot of birds. But we're talking about making decisions within the context of the entire habitat. So the thing about cores is very few people own all of a core. All right, a 250 acre forest might be on a 500 acre property, but, and here I will, let's back up for a second to that last picture that we just went past. Yeah, there we go. Here's an example of a view across several cores. It also happens to have a rather beautiful farm in the middle. There's nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, ecologically, this is one of the most special places I know in the region. But on the other side of that hill is land with very different characteristics. And if you were, oh, I don't know, a bear, and you decided to take a walk, pretty soon, once you've left the interior forest, you're negotiating areas that are being used for many other purposes. And if I could see all your hands and said, who saw a bear last year, you're all going to put your hand up. And if I asked you the next question, which is, where did you see the bear or the bears? In my case, I saw 9. Chances are it's going to be 3 places. As you were driving along a road, and maybe it was crossing in front of you, or going past your house. Third place you might have seen a bear is on a trail or in the forest, but most of us are seeing them as they're negotiating our habitat. So bears don't just stay in the woods, but use it for a big period of their life. And there's definitely a denser bear population in northwestern Connecticut and in the Berkshires than there is in western Dutchess County, let us say. And that's because the landscape's different and the connections are different. Size matters for the other reason I discussed as well. Some of you may be familiar with the tornado that went through Great Barrington in, I think, 1994 or 5, or the other one that around the same time hit the village of Cornwall, Connecticut. And each of those were intensive, destructive natural disturbances. In the Cornwall case, it went through a stand of old growth pine that was protected. It was protected by the Nature Conservancy, but it was not buffered from that size storm. And the vast majority of those 300-year-old trees were blown down. The theory behind having larger areas of intact forest is in part so that it can withstand stuff like that. And if you're in northern New England, you would laugh at a 250-acre core being meaningful at all, because they have 5,000 and 10,000 and 15,000 acre forests there. But in Western Massachusetts, Northwest Connecticut, and Eastern New York, the numbers that Julia gave earlier, which are really small patches of interior forest, are what we're working with for the most part. The other thing, of course, I just alluded to, unless you are really fortunate and you or your extended family own thousands of acres, chances are that the interior forest that occurs in your property occurs on other people's properties also. The trend in our region is for forest land to be smaller and smaller parcels. And again, that doesn't mean people can't do forestry on their land. It means, though, that management decisions tend to be made at the size of your property without necessarily seeing its value as part of something larger and intact. And I'm generalizing because some of you are a lot smarter than that. But I will pick on two Connecticut institutions that are not represented here tonight for my example of why it matters to know the context in which you're making those choices on your property. There's a neat model that UConn came up with that we are using that looked at aerial imagery of land cover, identified areas of interior forest, and then 10 years later looked at it again to see what had changed, what had moved from a forested to a non-forested state. And of course, those that do that, building houses does that, building bridges does that, creating new agricultural land does that. Between 2006 and 2016 in Northwest Connecticut, the single largest fragmenter of forest was management of water company land and state forest in one particular place where there was a 5,000 acre forest that neither of those entities recognized. And so they were dealing with management units of thousands of acres, but they managed to cut that thing in half, which made two smaller cores. That always bugged me because I figured I should have been in the room with them long before they did that. But it means that thinking about what can you do with your forested property really does require thinking about where is it situated and what is its function, as well as what are you trying to get out of it. So here's the big reveal, I guess. Follow the Forest is not just about interior forest. It is about combining really interesting science that some of our partners here on this call pioneered. The Nature Conservancy, Staying Connected Initiative, Berkshire Wildlife Linkages, Resilient and Connected Landscapes, all of those partnerships have zeroed in on something very similar to what we're about to discuss, with one key difference. We're interested in how you take that good science, combine it with local observation, and turn it into action at multiple scales. What you're looking at here is a slice of that big forested landscape I described earlier that covers the eastern half of the United States and the Maritime Canada, and happens to lie between the Hudson and the Connecticut rivers. On the other side of those two fairly substantial barriers to most, but not all, wildlife movement are other huge areas of potentially connected forest. The eastern Massachusetts one, you can kind of get a sense of it there if you're looking at where the darker green is stretching all the way up into Maine and onto the Maritimes. And the west of the Hudson area is the spine of the Appalachians up into the Adirondacks, with a few major barriers in between all of those things. Route 90, major buildings and settlements, things that make it harder for plants and animals to move. So we have focused our Follow the Forest efforts, and when I say our, I think I should say that HVA may have been the instigator of it or coined the phrase, but we see this as a massively shared endeavor among many groups of folk and individuals and organizations. But trying to answer the question for that part of it that we can wrap our heads around. How much of that core habitat needs to persist over time, more or less intact? And where are the connections that make it work? Those have been the key questions. We arbitrarily said, well, what if we had half of each of those blocks of interior forest in some form of permanent land protection? So there are conservation easements on it, or it's held by a land trust or held by a conservation organization. Which cores have that much protected land? Anything you see there in green is above the 50% threshold. That does not mean that all of the core is protected. It does not mean it's open to public access. Doesn't mean any of that. It just means if we're trying to keep enough of it, and land protection is one measure of durability and if not permanence, this is what you'd look at. And what you can see is there's an awful lot that's colored orange here that has less protected land. And it tends to be on the flanks of this swath of habitat running, not coincidentally, along the Appalachian Trail corridor for the first half of its length up into the Green Mountains. And a lot of folk have started to think in the last 10 years about the importance of connecting these habitats. We've known about core forest in the conservation community for as long as I've been working in this area, which is now more than 25 years. But connectivity is sort of the new aha realization. You want to jump in on this, Julia?
Sure, I'm happy to. And maybe we can take a moment to think about how some of these species are moving across our landscape. So earlier this year in southern New England, we had what became a famous moose moving throughout our landscape. And we were able to track this moose throughout Western Connecticut and Eastern New York using social media and neighborhood groups to understand where this moose was. So what this map is showing you is you have core forests in green. You have what we're going to talk about here shortly that we refer to as habitat linkages in purple. And then you have the movements of this moose moving throughout the landscape. And following people's pictures, we were able to identify that this is the same moose. It has this set of antlers. It was probably a young male moose. And I followed it through Woodbury, Connecticut, down into the Newtown, Brookfield, Danbury area of Connecticut, where the moose even walked through the parking lot of the mall. And then it traveled north, at some point swimming across Candlewood Lake, and then traveled north up into almost the Appalachian Trail corridor and headed east down into the Hudson Highlands, crossing 84 multiple times and also crossing the Taconic State Parkway. And so this really highlights the importance of, it's not just about the big forests. We can see that this moose likely used some of the forests at some instances of its movement, but given the type of animal that it is, it was also probably using wetlands and looking for the easiest path across the landscape. And so as we think about how do we connect this grand wildlife corridor, it's not just the forests, but we have to be able to connect these big important habitats to each other, utilizing all of the other habitats that we have. Tim, do you have anything to add?
Only that this is community science at its best, although all of the people who contributed that didn't know to get. If you put something on your Facebook page saying, I saw a moose and it's public, it's discoverable, hurrah, which is how we were able to put together this particular map. A moose is to some degree not the poster child for what we're discussing, although it is a wide-ranging species, because with a few other notable exceptions, bears being one and mountain lions being another, most of the movements we're going to talk about of animals and also plants within the follow the forest region are happening on smaller scales throughout the range of the species. In Connecticut, you won't ever see a bear crossing sign. And that's bothered me. So I bothered the Department of Transportation about it and was told fairly brusquely that they are not allowed because the bears cross wherever they want. And they weren't joking. That's what they said. And I thought, well, you know, there's a lot of data that suggests that while that is true, there is some method to the madness of areas where even bears, are a little discriminating about how and where they cross roads. And there are some ideas that we'll talk about a little bit later about how wildlife tends to move through a landscape that talk about whether it's a diffuse flow. This is Nature Conservancy terms, but we really like it. Whether species can go lots of different ways between habitat areas, or whether it is much more concentrated or even constrained. And the things that tend to constrain the ability for animals to move, and here's a great, actually, thank you for that image, are often the infrastructure that we have are very large water bodies. Again, looking at the blue on this map, and it does turn green where Follow the Forest is overlaid on it, but those are areas of very concentrated connectivity and presumed flow of animals among habitats in this system. Follow the Forest being centered in the middle. You can kind of also get the sense that the further north you go, the more opportunities there are. You're in the White Mountain National Forest, or you're in the Adirondacks, or you're in the Green Mountain National Forest, where there's large areas of intact forest habitat and many opportunities to cross not too busy roads. Whereas down in the southern part of New England and eastern New York, in some places, there are very tenuous linkages. I sometimes talk about this as an ice cream cone, and then when you bite the bottom out of an ice cream cone, it loses its integrity, and to some degree, that's what's concerning us now. It's not that we don't have enough trees; it's that the means for many plants and animals to disperse along there, particularly seeds that are dispersed by animals, are much more limited in places where we have 4-lane highways, where we have a lot of barriers to movement or big gaps between preferred habitat sites. Julia, you want to tackle the red circles in here and what we're trying to get at with?
Happy to. So as Tim mentioned, we're really setting up this idea of connectivity. And we talked really briefly about the process of mapping core forests, which is, in GIS terms, a relatively simple exercise to do. You utilize satellite imagery and basically categorize the landscape into different, what I'll call cover types, or basically forest versus development versus farm fields and other natural land cover types. And so mapping out these core forests, we can pretty easily pick out these contiguous forests. But mapping out the wildlife linkages is a lot more challenging, and we have a great basis from the data that we were looking at earlier from the Nature Conservancy and some other scientific data that's really feeding into this. But it's really an exercise that has to happen at a local level. So what we're displaying on the map now are these circles that we refer to as wildlife linkages. And I'm going to zoom in here for a second because they're a little bit easier to look at closer in the map. And what we've done is we've taken the data from the Nature Conservancy and other scientific sources, as well as local knowledge from not only HVA, but other organizations, and sort of asked this question of where do we expect there to be good connections between core forests? And we drew circles on the map. And what you can see on this map is that some of these circles, for example, this one over here on the Taconic, is an open circle. And that means that this wildlife linkage has not yet been assessed. Whereas this one over here that has a faint sort of light tan color in it is an assessed linkage. And so what we're doing is we're asking this question of where do we expect the good connection points to be? And then we're asking community scientists, volunteers, staff, to go out and look at these connection points. And generally speaking, these connection points are areas where the core forests are as close to the road as they get, which is about 300 feet. And there's a road running in between. And so we ask people to walk on the road or drive on the road, whatever is most safe, and give us some information about what's on either side of the road and what sort of barriers may exist. And this is data that does not exist at a regional scale. we don't have GIS information for where all the guardrails are or where are all the fences are. So this is really information that can only be collected from this local level. And I will, in a minute, sort of walk you through this form and the exercise of how do we go about doing this. But first, we wanted to give the example of two areas that pose particular challenges to wildlife movement, and how we thought about sort of drawing these circles, and then also the information that we've gathered to this point. So the area that I've just zoomed in on is an area in eastern New York, where we have sort of two large ridge lines that both run north-south. In between the ridge lines is a train track and a fairly busy state route, both of which also travel north-south. Much of the development that has occurred in this area has occurred in that valley in between the two ridge lines. So we have these we have natural movement spaces and then large barriers to wildlife movement in between them. Using satellite imagery, our original circle was down in this area. And this was older satellite imagery that after the satellite imagery was taken, a large electrical infrastructure project was built in that area. And so that very much broke the connection. We have since had volunteers go out and assess this area. What we learned is there is a tenuous connection in between these two mountain ranges that crosses not only the large state route and the train track, but two additional neighborhood roads, and could serve some aspect of functionality in terms of wildlife movement. But perhaps better location could be a riparian corridor just to the north. And what we've learned in really studying these maps and looking at wildlife movement is that riparian corridors, particularly in areas that are heavily developed, prove to be some of the most critical areas for wildlife movement. You often have at least a little bit of natural land cover types alongside streams and rivers, and wildlife naturally move along them, and they prove to be excellent ways for wildlife to move throughout the landscape. And Tim, I will pass it over to you for a second example.
Excellent. Second example is a spot that at first blush looked really obvious. This is located in along the North Canaan and Norfolk lines in Northwest Connecticut on Route 44. The really large area of core forest to the southwest, this area over here, is all Great Mountain. So very big core. The Blackberry River runs roughly parallel to Route 44 in between it and the areas to its north and northeast, which go over to Haystack Mountain and then on into Massachusetts. So it's a narrow connection, but actually going there and looking at it also shows that it's a really hard one. There's a 8-foot embankment on the north side of that, a rattlesnake could go up, but bears and deer and flying squirrels might do something a little different. And there's quite a lot of houses. So the topography was an issue. There's a number of highway infrastructure things that made it challenging. And it turns out that looking at that and then going a little bit to the east said, actually, the best way to link two cores is to do it where those arrows are, which includes actually some farm field land, some river area, and some forest. When we looked at the parcels that were under it, there's one 42-acre parcel there on the south side that was actually being offered to the state of Connecticut as conservation land, and they weren't sure really whether they wanted it. But being able to highlight its potential function here bumped it up and bumped up their interest level. Again, it means that those circles that might be informed by good predictive science are just predictors until we combine it with field observations, and field observations can be done by any of you.
So if you had interest in performing a wildlife linkage, your logical next question is really, how do I go about doing this? And so we'll be dropping some links in the chat towards the end of the presentation. But on the Follow the Forest website, which is followtheforest.org, we have this landing page that really starts to walk you through how to assess a wildlife linkage. And there are really two key parts to this. We have an online interactive map, which is how you can understand where the circles are drawn and select a circle to assess yourself. And so I'm just getting that uploaded now. And so this looks very similar to the map that we were looking at earlier. You know, the linkages are slightly different colors, but it gives you the similar idea. At the same time, you will also need our assessment form. So returning back to that website, we have this yellow box down here, which is a clickable link. And this brings you to an online survey that includes all of the questions that we're asking for in a linkage assessment. And I'm going to walk you through just really briefly sort of what we're looking for when you're doing a linkage assessment. And taking sort of 2 steps back, I will say the first and most important piece of doing a linkage assessment is ensuring your own safety, being aware of your surroundings, you know, knowing where you are, and really going out prepared. So we start off our linkage assessments asking for basic information, understanding who you are, when you're going out, and to what area you've chosen. There's a little bit of information that has to be collected from the map that I started off this conversation with. So we ask for a linkage ID, and this allows us, when you submit the assessment, to connect the data you've collected with our existing GIS data. So returning to this map for a second, if I zoom in a little bit further, you can click on different areas and get information from the map. So if I click on a linkage, it brings up this box, and you can see that it says habitat linkages, and it has all of this information. Of course, before you assess a linkage, you'll want to make sure that this question, has this linkage been assessed, is a no. And then the other piece of information you need is this unique ID, which appears both right here and up here in bold. So if we were assessing this linkage, this would be linkage 173, and I would input that into the linkage ID box. At any point, if one of these steps is challenging for a volunteer, I encourage you, we ask about road section and town and state. So if for whatever reason you couldn't find the linkage ID, we should be able to glean enough information from town and state and road section for you to continue. We really want this to be an exercise that anyone can do. And so if at any point you experience challenges, we want to be able to help you. So next we have a map, and this is an interactive map that allows you to adjust the actual geography of the linkage. And when I'm referring to the geography, it's the shape and location of that circle on the map. So on this map, you can use a tool to draw out where you feel how it should be changed. So sometimes we have linkage volunteers come back and say that the linkage needs to be shifted, say north, to a better crossing point, or maybe it's actually more constricted than what we were able to see on the map. Any photos of the linkage that you can gather while you're out in the field are always fantastic. It really helps on the back end to see how you're answering the questions and how that's reflected on the landscape. Returning to the map, we also ask for information about the core forests that you're linking. So every habitat linkage connects at least 2 core forests and occasionally 3 core forests. So again, returning to the map, if I now click on the core forest, another box is going to pop up, and that's going to give us the core forest ID, which is the 6-digit long number that we would then put back into the form. And you need both core forest IDs, so we're always connecting at least 2 to enter into the form. Again, the 6-digit number. From there, I ask you to pull a little bit more information from the map. We're curious to know if there's already existing protected land within the circle on the map, and also how many tax parcels are within that linkage. And this really helps us with future questions to understand, are we in an area where parcels are large and there's maybe only 1 or 2 or 3 tax parcels, or are we in an area that's highly parcelized and we're talking about 15 or more parcels? I ask you to identify if there are other possible linkages between these cores. So we may have identified one circle on the map, but it's possible there's 1 or 2 or 3 other spots where there are good crossing points for wildlife. And if that's the case, we would love to add them to the map as well. Stepping into the field portion of the data collection, we ask generally about road conditions. Of course, the roads themselves and the amount and speed of traffic are really the biggest barrier for most wildlife. So knowing not just what type of road we're dealing with, but about how fast cars are traveling and how many cars you see really helps us to inform, action steps moving forward. Additionally, development is another large category that gives us an idea of how the landscape is within the linkage. So we ask you to identify, how much development is within the linkage and if wildlife would need to travel in backyards. And I'll take a moment here just to note that I'm not asking you to count houses within the linkage or count the number of cars that you saw. We really have this scale. I talk about development, little, scattered, or dense. And each of us are going to have different perceptions of what those words mean in terms of how many houses were within the linkage. But what we found is that this is still a really effective measure of wildlife linkages and how it translates to conservation. So if you're stuck in between 2 categories, say sometimes when I'm out there doing this, I get stuck between a little bit of development and scattered development. And if that's the case, just always provide more information in the notes section. The more information we get to understand where your head is and how you're thinking about this, the better the assessment is and the better, it can be used to work with our partners and inform conservation action moving forward. Of course, we have to ask about wildlife. So whether or not you saw signs of wildlife, such as tracks or scat, whether you actually saw wildlife moving on the landscape, or if you saw roadkill. We then ask about the different vegetation types on the sides of the road. And this helps to inform sort of who might be moving on the landscape or what challenges there may be. For bear and deer moving throughout our landscape, there's not that many barriers to their movement. I've seen them in my backyard. We see them moving through farm fields. But for something like a salamander, a farm field might provide much more of a barrier than it does for that bear or deer. We ask about invasive plants. This can be useful in many ways. And one of the things I really want to mention here is that we understand that not everyone filling out this form is going to be able to identify invasive plants or say for sure which species they are. And again, that's okay. We want this to be something that is accessible for anyone to be able to fill out, and that can also be a teaching tool. This has proven to be really useful in schools to talk about many of these different concepts. And so if you aren't sure, that's okay. We ask about management activities along either side of the road. This helps to understand, how the landscape might be actively changing in this moment. And then, of course, we ask about the barriers to wildlife passage. And I would say this is really sort of the big part of the questionnaire. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have data layers for this information. So being able to understand what you see on either side and what might be shifting wildlife movement or preventing wildlife movement is really quite critical. The next question is whether or not there's a bridge or a culvert within the linkage. And this is really just a brief assessment of that bridge or culvert. There's a protocol that goes much more in depth that partners work on to really understand the nature of the culvert in terms of terrestrial and aquatic passage. And we've taken sort of just a really brief, what does this culvert look like? Estimate how big it is, how much water is in it, and whether or not there is a big drop. And that gives us the ability to say, okay, if this is, a 1 foot in diameter culvert, we're dealing with something relatively small versus an 8 foot large box culvert. And then this last section is really my favorite. We sort of ask you to stop and think about everything that you saw within the linkage and rate it. Where does it fall on this scale from excellent to poor? Again, my excellent might be different from your excellent, but what we've seen in going through now 133 linkages is it all really falls out the way you would expect it to. The barriers that people are seeing and how they're impacting that linkage are getting these to fall into categories that really make sense, and then that can inform conservation action. So our last set of questions is really asking, how can we improve wildlife passage within this region? Help us think through what we can work with our partners on to really improve or maintain wildlife passage within this region. So I always enjoy looking over this section when we get new linkage forms in. It's really quite aspirational. You can see that we even talk about wildlife bridges or overpasses in this section. And while that may not be something that can happen everywhere on the landscape, thinking outside of sort of all of our normal constraints can allow us to be really creative and potentially find new solutions for these challenges on our landscape. So I am going to switch back to the story map, Tim, and pass it back to you. Actually, our slides.
So that was a lot. And so I guess I should jump in for a moment and say, we designed that form after asking a 15-year-old to go out and use a paper version of it. And that 15-year-old did brilliantly and made some suggestions on how to improve it. And we have since used it with middle school, high school, interested citizens, people who do not have a technical background, but who can read a landscape because they are attuned to it. It's not something you do in 10 minutes, but if you combine the information that's available on the Geographic Information Systems map with what you see on the ground, it can be a lot of really useful data that you provide. And you start to see the landscape differently as you're driving through it. I've had the joy of watching children in my rearview mirror in the backseat of my car saying, "Do you think an animal could go here or there, Dad?" And I would, pause and would have that conversation. So it's a easily graspable concept, a simplification in part of much more complicated processes. There are many more layers to habitat connectivity than just how do you cross the road, but how do you cross the road is rather critical piece of it. Second thing I thought I'd mention is there is that ability to identify a potential linkage where we didn't identify one. We did not put every potential linkage on that map. There are places where we didn't even draw a red circle. So if you find yourself feeling a little left out and are wondering, gosh, but there's a core forest near me, I think there's probably a way it connects. There's an easy mechanism for defining your own linkage area and assessing it and letting us know. These are examples of people doing all of those things. I'm really happy to see all the reflective vests being worn. But you can see it's a range of folk all sort of discussing how easy or hard this would be. And I guess we should also ask for what, right? We talked about bears, we talked about moose. How about mid-sized mammals? How about squirrels? How about field mice, which are really fast? if you think about sort of a range of species, how about turtles? So in some places, some where particularly where there are other reasons for animals to cross the road than just getting to the forest, there might be other actions that would need to be taken to safeguard them. Let's try the next slide, Julia. I'll pause for a moment and think.
Oh, here we go. Hold on. Sorry, my Zoom controls are in the way.
That's okay. Grab yourself another swig of tea or whatever you have while we seamlessly transition. Here we go. I don't know if my friend Deb Cohen is back on or not, but I threw the slide of a much younger me and her husband Edgar hugging a tree on here with her in mind. I'm going to try to inspire you a little bit to think of other ways that the lands that you love or own or interact with are part of these linked systems. And there's a few concepts that I think are useful to think about. I mentioned size before, right? A small area is vulnerable to a dramatic disturbance. And if it's dependent on groundwater that's being filtered from somewhere else, and the connection between that place that's providing the water and the wetland that needs it is broken, that can be a problem too. Condition, well, I think Edgar and I are hugging a great big ash tree there, and I bet that if I went back to that property today, it wouldn't be a live ash tree. That's a hard one. But we were in a forest that had extremely large, healthy trees in it, and that had been charcoaled before that, right? So another way of thinking about how functional is the habitat in my area is to get a sense of its overall condition. What species are present? Are they overwhelmed with excessive deer browse, which was in the comments, or are they overwhelmed with invasives, or are they relatively healthy? And you'll get a range of opinions on that. And one thing I think I should stress is Follow the Forest has not come out and said, don't cut another tree, we don't believe in forestry. But it does say think hard about the function of the forest habitat that you're looking at and what management might help sustain that and what might have unwanted complications as far as we go. Because it's really good to understand what you are managing for and what's the potential there. And there are good foresters and good ecologists who can talk to you about that. The landscape context picture is a beautiful aerial that was taken a long time ago, but of the forest of the Mount Washington, Mount Raga Plateau in the corner of Northwest Connecticut and Southwest Mass. And the reason I like that picture is embedded within it is a wetland habitat that's important, and beyond it is much larger sustaining forest habitat. If the wetland habitat were surrounded by houses, it wouldn't be a particularly good wetland. And that again is the point I made earlier about thinking beyond the land that you directly oversee or can impact when you're wondering how to help it persist over time in an ecologically healthy way. Next one. The other idea to keep in mind is that really everything you see on the landscape that wasn't built, and every habitat that we have is an expression of sort of three factors. Geology, and I would also say topography rolled into that, climate, and disturbance, both natural and caused by us. The one that's standing in for disturbance history there happens to be the core forests of Connecticut, and what you see in yellow are the edges. And what isn't either of those two colors is a more built or agricultural environment. Of these three factors, geology is a fairly constant influence. If it's an acidic ridgetop, it's going to be conducive for some things. And if it's calcareous ledges, it's going to some degree mitigate acidic rainfall that's making its way down to the valleys. And those, unless you mine it and remove it, it's going to still be a factor, and it's going to help predict what species might find it more or less hospitable. Climate is the thing changing most dramatically now. And disturbance is the thing that happens fastest. A thought on, and it relates to the movement of species. One of the things that I have done for almost 20 years now here in early spring is go out with my initially very young children and now my grown children on the first warm, rainy night in spring to places where I know amphibians are crossing roads. And they're moving from forest land to wetlands. And inevitably, the places where I encounter them are when they are trying to slither or hop across roads where cars are moving very fast. And the roads are where they are because they're not in the wetlands and they're not on the slopes of the hills. But it does bisect that that path they have to follow. And it's not a long path. The salamanders and the wood frogs are sometimes moving only 90 or 100 meters. But the big challenge that they have is that crossing. What I've noticed over 20 years is that that night of the first warm spring rain has moved up by 3 weeks. So it used to be late March, 40 degrees or more. I'd expect March 23rd, March 25th, even as late as the first week of April 20 years ago. And now it's March 8th, March 10th. So that salamander over there on the left, which is the spotted salamander, is one of the more common ones we see. Frankly, the other major challenge that they have is if they happen to be passing after they've crossed the road and encounter a curb. And a horizontal, or rather a vertical curb, can be a barrier for them. There is a Cape Cod curve that looks like this, that's on a slant, that are used in other places that can help them negotiate that. But it's an interesting design challenge. We're talking to highway departments about this as a spot where you should try something a little different. All three of the creatures in this slide depend on being able to move across spatial gaps between preferred habitats. The pollinator that you see there and the bird that's sort of mirrored in the bluebird box behind it are also having to cross landscapes, some forested, some not, but over great distances, and are encountering, in some cases, gaps between their preferred habitats that they can't cross. A lot of birds hit buildings as they're on the flyways. The bear that you see there is using Phragmites for cover. That's the 8th bear I saw last year. And that's interesting because Phragmites is a pernicious invasive plant that most of us pull our hair out about as a monoculture in native habitat, but the bear is using it as crossing the road. I saw that bear on my way into Canaan, where I live, going from one Phragmites patch to another, and that was the place it chose to go. That doesn't mean that the Phragmites gets a free pass. It means that no habitat is completely sterile, and it's interesting to see how wildlife. So if you're thinking about what species can handle our infrastructure, picture on the left, I took this summer on a trip through Yellowstone. If we had bison here, it would be interesting to see whether we would give them the latitude that they have in a national park, but they definitely own the roads there. Whereas that bear, that's the 9th bear I saw this year, that's in front of my house in Canaan. And I was actually walking along the sidewalk, and my neighbor said, "You need to stop and look up." And so I did, and that's who was there. I live on a 1/4 acre lot in a community of 1/4 and 1/2 acre lots, and it's overrun with bear. Some of them are there because we've provided all the things that bears like. We have bird feeders that stay up all year. We have really attractive and insecure garbage. We have grills that don't get cleaned terribly well. But the other, that's what draws the bears into the town to stay. But the bears are also moving through it because there's a den on a hill just outside of town, and there's a great big wetland just beyond the town, and we are the shortest distance between those 2 points. So it isn't just about the big intact habitats. It's about, in some cases, what's our relationship going to be with, let's pick on the bear, an uneasy closeness with some wildlife that are moving through areas that we also occupy. Or if we think about the salamander, are there things we can do a little differently with our infrastructure that would facilitate its successful crossing when it needs to in the spring? Julia mentioned overpasses for wildlife. This is a picture, a series of pictures I took on that same trip. This is in the Salish Kootenai Native American reservation up near Flathead Lake in Montana, north of Missoula, and other side of Glacier National Park. And this was actually designed by tribal members at an area where their wildlife migrated every year. Lots of elk, some mountain lion, in very great numbers. And it includes both a culvert, actually quite a lot of culverts, and this one overpass along a 4-mile stretch of highway. I think they put in 60 culverts like this that can allow terrestrial use as well as water to flow through. And you see a lot of these in the West, actually, more and more, in part because of the kinds of great migrations that their large game animals are doing. Our deer are not moving in herds of hundreds along the same routes. They're following diffuse patterns around the edges of our forests. And our moose tend to be moving in fairly solitary journeys where they want. But that doesn't mean that there aren't places where the best way to cross the road is with an assist, either under it or over it. And here I'd like to tip my hat to some really great folks in a partnership called the Staying Connected Initiative, and another partnership called Berkshire Wildlife Linkages, that have spent a lot of time looking at roadkill data, where animals tend to be concentrating, and trying to ask questions like, if we only had one of these that we could actually get over the Mass Pike, where would it be? Or under the Mass Pike, where would it be? And I think there are probably, on Route 84, the moose's travel notwithstanding, another opportunity to think about a significant infrastructure fix for some of that wide-ranging species connectivity. But there's only going to be a couple of them. And the rest is going to come down to, if a culvert needs to be replaced because it can't handle the increased flow from the kinds of storms we're likely to get, can it be replaced in such a way that it also allows land animals to use it? And there's folk who have done some brilliant work on that. And there is a whole other assessment process specifically for road or stream crossings with bridges and culverts for their ability to facilitate terrestrial passage. And it complements what we've been sharing. We're kind of talking about what else is going on that road. But if, when you are doing an assessment, you're like, the only way that this really works is if they cross that bridge or go under that culvert, then there is another level of detail that we can get into. Anyway, I find those things inspiring. I'd like to see more. Then there's always the really minor things you can do. I do stop for turtles, right? And I do move salamanders across the road. And I do find myself attuned to the places and the times of year when I'm more likely to see certain wildlife. Right now, I'm more likely to see foxes at night because now they're out and about looking for mates. and see them much more than in other times of year. So if you don't feel like standing on the side of a road assessing what habitat it might constitute for animals trying to cross it, but you are wondering about how to live a little more mindfully on the landscape, there's a lot you can do to think about, you know, who's up and about at different times of day and times of the year, and maybe when to drive a little slower. That might be my big wrap up here. Julia, did you have more you wanted to add?
No, I was just going to stop our screen share and see if we wanted to address some of the questions. And I really just wanted to highlight that I think if you take nothing else away, one of the biggest things is that we share this landscape with all of the creatures on Earth. And so Follow the Forest is not just a way of thinking about this grand wildlife corridor, but thinking about how we live more harmoniously with the wildlife that we're sharing our spaces with. And so whether that's, as Tim mentioned, you know, wildlife linkages or moving amphibians, or even just thinking about what we're doing in our small yards, you know, there's so much that we can each be doing.
I want to recognize some of the questions in the chat and then throw it open to your responses. There was a question about how we might reach out to conservation organizations who might have the ability to protect vulnerable lands. Luckily, that's the business that Ariana and I and Julia and several other people on this call are part of. And I would, depending upon where you are, we're happy to refer you to, or perhaps be the partner you might need for that. There are a lot though. In Northwest Connecticut, almost every town has a land trust. In the Berkshires, there are several regional or statewide organizations as well as local land trusts. In Eastern New York, there are county-wide land trusts and some ones that focus on smaller areas. There was that question about who has the means. Land protection doesn't always have to involve hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, but sometimes it does. And all of us have thoughts about it. There's probably a limit beyond which people can compete with a developer's price, but we've been pretty successful to date in finding ways to meet landowner needs and conserve property. Russ Cohen had a great reference to a linkage that he's concerned about in Lenox. Since I know Russ, I'll follow up with him about it. And he's absolutely right. If you think about where the Arcadia shop is on Route 7 and everything there, east-west movement is as important as north-south in this system. It is sometimes harder, right? Julia was talking about how the alignment of the ridges and the alignment of the roads and the alignment of the rivers tends to funnel or channel all of us moving in those ways. Whereas the moose that we showed and other species that are trying in ways to get around Pittsfield are going to have to go west-east or east-west. And some of that's a little more tenuous. He also had questions about which species of plants are dispersed by animals that I'm worried about not dispersing. Well, the heavier nut types from the central Appalachians, you know, that if squirrels trot across bridges, they'll carry them. I think more to the point, I can't tell you exactly which habitat we'll see here in 200 years, but it's going to be ones that are more conducive to species that right now are happier hundreds of miles to our south. It's going to make us redefine a little bit what we consider to be native to our region. Gave you the deep geological view of time at the beginning. Given time, quite a lot of movement is possible. I want to make sure I caught the other questions there.
Tim, while you're looking in the
Yep.
chat, one thing I wanted to jump in on there that I find to be an interesting example that someone brought up to me is the plants that are dispersed by ants, which are currently impacted on our landscape. So we do have a few forest understory species that are dispersed, particularly by ants. And if you think about the giant barrier that a road would pose to a small ant trying to cross the road with a seed or pollen from a plant, that is a huge barrier. So it's not just as we think about climate change and species moving, but currently on our landscape, this is a challenge that exists that, we often go to things like the bobcat and the deer and the bear, but there's so many more fine scale processes that we don't think about as often.
That's a great point. I had a fun conversation with our friends over at Hudsonia when we were first starting to think about fall of the forest 4 years ago. And it's interesting to talk to people who are serious scientists about ideas that we've simplified so that they can be understood by generalists. And I guess what I took away from that conversation is they were very encouraging, and then said, it's the smaller intra regional movements for species or seeds that are ant dispersed or the amphibians or reptiles that may be at greater risk than the odd bear. And I think that is true. We're trying to talk about things that are happening at multiple scales within a landscape of connectivity. And in some of our towns, it's the local biodiversity that's really regionally restricted that becomes important. Either species that are at the very edge of their contiguous range, and if they can't shift north, usually it's north, they're going to become isolated. I think northern flying squirrel might be something like that. Currently hanging on to 2 sites in Northwest Connecticut, and everything else is 4 or 5 miles to the north in Massachusetts. And I don't know the answer to how that squirrel gets from where it is now to the next spot it will be happy. It's not going to soar that distance. So there's much more for us to learn, and more for you to suggest. If you have a question or a comment you'd like to make now and would like to unmute yourself, you're welcome to for the last 10 minutes.
Tim, I did see a question in the chat about deer and how deer are being managed so that our native biodiversity can thrive and move in response to climate change. Yeah,
so I'm going to use some terms that I learned early in my conservation career, because deer are a source of stress for those of us who worry about what they're doing, but also in ecological terms. The stress is excessive herbivory, right? They're eating in some places where there are really dense concentrations of them, a great deal of the understory and shrub layer in forests, and can impact forest regeneration. By far, the largest threat to the habitats we're talking about is their utter destruction by development, followed by very closely impacts of climate. And then there are a range of stresses, deer being one, invasive plants being another, that all have impacts. So yeah, deer do have the impacts that were mentioned. There are more deer now, it is estimated, in our area than there were pre-European settlement, because there's more edge, because they're not being hunted as effectively by people who were sustaining themselves through that hunting. And there is no way, short of the kinds of massive culling that they do in more densely populated areas, to reduce those numbers by any meaningful amount. We don't have that many hunters. And I guess I'd also caution that while I recognize the impacts, I'm speaking just me now, other organizations may feel differently. There are all these synergies between those stresses. 20 years ago, we got really worried about barberry as an invasive plant in a forest system and as a major threat to that. But we ultimately decided that if we either mechanically removed the barberry or pulled it up, that the deer would absolutely hammer whatever wanted to grow up after that. And so a choice was made, and when I say we, I mean back in my Nature Conservancy days, a choice was made to use herbicide and have the barberry kind of deter the deer from eating what was growing up through it. And indeed, what was growing up through it was a resident seed bank of largely native material. But there are trade-offs in all of that. And, I just mentioned herbicide, and I just mentioned spraying, and having to make choices there. So I would caution against just treating deer as a symptom, but I would definitely think of them as part of a series of interactions that can have unwanted impacts and that have to be considered within all of that. That's as far as I got on deer.
Great. Well, thanks, Tim and Julia. If there are any last questions, feel free to either post them in the chat or just unmute yourself and you can ask it. If there are no further questions,
Some very nice comments being posted from folk who have to sign off, though. Right back at you. Thank you for all of your care, concern, and dedication to these lands we share.
well, thank you so much, Tim and Julia. Really appreciate you guys doing this and all the great information you provided to us today. I just want to let everybody know that we will be following up in the next few days with an email to each of you that will include all the links posted in the chat, as well as the recording of this presentation. And it will also have some pledges that you can potentially sign up for. So that's it. Thank you all so much for joining and have a great night.
Take care, everyone.